Okay, and with that, we are officially live. Let me make sure everybody can see everybody. There we go. Welcome to this evening's edition of the Black Freedom Lectures. My name is Eve Ewing. I'm the curator of the Black Freedom Lectures. I'm coming to you from the city currently known as Chicago, which, as we always like to remember, is the occupied lands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and Ottawa nations, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. We have another great week. I hope that you're all good and happy and healthy. This Friday, we have a new lecture dropping from Dr. Ashan Crawley on Black sacred life. If you don't follow Ashan Crawley on the internets, you are missing out. He is an incredible visual artist, scholar of theology, divinity, a really dope person, and also a very dynamic speaker. So you definitely don't want to miss that. So that lecture will be dropping this Friday. And next Thursday at 6 p.m. Central, he will be joining us for a live Q&A. So as always, we want you to come watch it. And as always, if you can't remember anything I just said, don't worry about it. If you sign up for our newsletter, blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter, then we will remind you of everything that is going on. But please join us. New lecture this Friday, Q&A next Thursday. And now for this evening's conversation, as always, I want to begin by saying thanks to our team, Imani Lagrone and Siando Mohutsua, as well as our ASL interpreter, Barbara Williams-Finley, and our friends and colleagues at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture and the Mellon Foundation. So I'm here with two very, very special guests who are going to be in conversation this evening. The first is Lester Kern III, who is a doctoral candidate at the Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice. Lester has a lot of research experience, including providing research supports across several projects, evaluation research on violence prevention, workforce development. He's here tonight because of his interest and knowledge in the field of spatial inequality and spatial distributions of inequality, but he also has extensive background in mental health care policy, law, punishment, and social control, race, ethnicity, gun culture, and alternatives to arrest and incarceration. So he is an up-and-coming scholar to know. Check him out. And he will be in conversation this evening with our very, very special guest, Dr. Tony G. Reames, who's an assistant professor and director of the Urban Energy Justice Lab at the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan, up the road in Ann Arbor. He is a JPB Environmental Health Fellow at Harvard University and a visiting scholar at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at UPenn. He is an interdisciplinary scholar, which we love at the Black Freedom Lectures. He has a PhD in public administration from the University of Kansas. He also has a Master of Engineering Management from Kansas State University, which means he's probably the best equipped on this call to fix something if it breaks. And he has a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. And his research, as you're going to hear tonight, investigates fair and equitable access to affordable, reliable, clean energy. If you missed his lecture on Friday, please go back and watch it after this conversation is done. If you are like me, you will come away with a renewed understanding of why this issue is so important. His research explores the production and persistence of energy disparities across race, class, and place. He is a licensed professional engineer and has worked in both private and public sectors. He's a U.S. Army veteran, and he's reached the rank of captain. Dr. Reames has been named to the GRIS 50 Fixers list, Midwest Energy News 40 Under 40, and Oakland County, Michigan Elite 40. And he was actually appointed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer to the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice and the Governor's Climate Justice Brain Trust. In other words, he is a very, very big deal. Please join me in enthusiastically welcoming Lester and Dr. Reames. I'm going to turn the conversation over to them.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ewing. And also thank you, Dr. Reames, for being in conversation with me today. I'm very excited to talk to you. I learned a ton from your lecture that was posted, and I feel like there's really no better way to get to understand your work and also its broader implications than let's just jump straight in. So one of the things that you talked about in the lecture that was really striking is this discrepancy, right? The United Nations considers energy access a basic human right. But in the US, that's not a legally protected right across the country. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, why is that and where does that leave us with our energy justice efforts?
Yeah, I want to thank Dr. Ewing for the invitation to be with you all tonight and the opportunity to provide the lecture. And thank you, Lester, for what I'm hoping and I know will be a great conversation. I think you bring up a really good point, thinking about, in the lecture I asked, is energy a basic human right? or access to energy a basic human right? And if we think it is, then why is it not universal? And if it's not, should it be? You can't see it as well, but I have on my United Nations Sustainable Development Goal pin for number 7, which is affordable access to clean energy. And so the United Nations and its several sustainability development goals says that energy should be a basic right. Here it is a commodity, right? We all get our monthly utility bill. We look at the price. Some of us have sticker shock, and we're like, okay, why are we paying for this thing that some may think should be free? That the sun gives us, that the wind gives us, that we can get from water. Because energy development and energy expansion was funded by investors and some by the government, we have a system that was created that we are paying for the investment that we made to expand electricity. We're 99.9% electrified in the United States, but we're still using that model of the original expansion of electricity. And so some in the energy justice movement and the energy justice scholarship are saying that, that model is outdated and there should be a new model for how we access and how we engage with energy.
Thank you. One of the parts, right, that you talked about that I thought was, that really put this into context and actually gave description, right, to these tangible effects, right, of our energy policy approaches, right? You talked about, the huge impacts, right, on mental and physical health in relation to energy consumption, to energy burdens. And you talked about, in your study, the huge increase on rates of premature death, decreases in life expectancy, increases in people reporting being in poor health. And yet often we view these problems as individual problems. I can't pay my light bill, or I'm a couple months behind on my DTE energy bill or my WE energy bill or something like that. And we often view these, as individual problems and not necessarily policy problems. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how we can change this narrative and help people understand that, if you can't pay your light bill, that's not just a you problem, right? Yeah. That's a societal problem. It's a societal failing that requires societal solutions.
Yeah, I often tell a story about, how when I started doing this research and how important I realized the issue of, the lack of access, the lack of affordability of energy was. I was doing some qualitative research in Kansas City, interviewing people in the urban core, and I was talking to a woman and, just asking them, what do you think about, energy affordability? And she talked about back then when, before we got these smart meters that everybody has now where they can, shut you off remotely and check your bill, your usage remotely, they would still roll a truck to do shutoffs, right? And so the woman I was speaking to, was saying, like, when I see the utility truck come down my street, my heart rate goes up. And I was like, tell me more, what do you mean? And she was like, even if my bill was paid and I know that they weren't coming to shut me off, I knew they were probably coming to shut off a neighbor. And that would impact me because I would either have to run an extension cord to them, or I would have to store their groceries in my refrigerator because their power was turned off, or, let them come over and use appliances at my house. And so there's this, connection between, the energy system and the energy access, in a community, in a block, in a city. But we don't think about it that way. Like you say, we think about delivering energy as a system, but the consumption and the access to energy, we think about it very individually. And I think if we can kind of, take a systems approach to the whole global energy system, then I think some of the policy changes that we need to make would be glaring us in the face.
I definitely appreciate that. I have some things that I want to ask you later a bit about, like, the localized approach to this. But one thing that I do kind of want to talk about right now that is, a macro issue, right? We would be remiss not to mention the impact of COVID, the pandemic and its effects on energy security. Utilities have suspended shutoffs in many ways, or in many places, but we know that many families haven't recovered economically from this pandemic, right? And perhaps won't for far after, right, this pandemic. Thinking about what are the futures for families who may not have been able to pay their electricity bill, or their heating bill during the pandemic. What kind of policies or what approaches would help people, or families that are in this position?
Yeah, I think, so the whole idea of how we have created energy assistance here in the U.S. Came out of the 1970s during the oil energy crisis. And so there was an oil embargo between oil producing countries in the Midwest and Western countries that were supporting Israel in one of the wars. And so this recognition that, because gas prices were going up, and we saw this again on the East Coast just a couple of weeks ago, everybody was posting on social media about really high gas prices. And so that same thing happened in the 70s. And the disproportionate impact on low-income households in particular, made its way through, Congress, and they created what's called the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. LIHEAP, that some people call it. And so that is our federal program that helps people pay their utility bills. It's operated, pretty standardized across the country. There's usually a summer assistance that people can get and a winter assistance. Some states only allow you to get it once a year. And we spend billions of dollars on that program each year. Of course, it's never enough for the need. But we saw during COVID that, there were several infusions of cash into that program. So everybody's heard of the CARES Act, which was one of our, coronavirus stimulus packages, put about, $900 million into that program. And then the last package that Congress passed put, a couple $2 billion into that program. The challenge has been, because there are moratoriums, people are like, oh, I don't have to worry about my bills right now. I got a whole bunch of other stuff I need to think about. Coronavirus, right? And so although there were additional resources to deal with assistance, there may not have been the increase applications and people trying to get that assistance. So, I say if there's money sitting there, utility companies know who's behind on their utility bills. How can we be more strategic, more effective in, paying those bills onto past due bills? And so there was a pilot here in Michigan where the utility worked with the state, identified some households that were behind, let the state know, and the state made direct payments. And my colleague that was working on that said that, the majority of people that had this direct payment to their past due bill actually were able to catch up on their utility bill. So again, thinking strategic, how do we, if the goal is assistance, how do we help people, with technology now, with, forward thinking, progressive thinking, so people don't have this big debt hanging over them.
I appreciate that. One thing that you mentioned in there that I think feeds into this next question, right, is the tension between state responses and then federal responses. As you talked about, and one thing that recently, right, as you alluded to, also has been on everybody's minds, right, the state level effects of energy concerns. At the beginning of the year, right, we saw that millions of people in Texas found themselves with no electricity. This has a lot, to do with the differences in how Texas is managed. But how should we look at an event like that through an energy justice lens?
Yeah. So energy justice is really all about how do we fairly disseminate the benefits and costs of our energy system, and how can we be fair and impartial in our decision making. I was on a call a few weeks ago, and one of the viewers said, well, shouldn't we be partial now? And I was like, well, yeah. So the whole idea of energy equity is that there needs to be some partiality, right? Because we're trying to overcome the bad decisions of the past. But one thing, when I think about what happened in Texas, and there's new reporting coming out about the actual number of deaths and the disparities in who suffered and who had their lights turned on more rapidly than others, is that we really need to think about, our underinvestment in infrastructure. And so expanding the definition of infrastructure beyond, roads and bridges, to start thinking about our energy system and buildings, and then including social infrastructure, right? Human infrastructure. How do we think about, how we protect people when our systems fail? And so there's this connection between the failures and underinvestment in our energy infrastructure and how that impacted people in their daily lives, with some people actually dying, right?
Pardon the technical difficulties I had.
I kept going until you came back.
Hey, see, don't skip a beat, man. I was hoping, could you talk a little bit more about the disparities in that? How was the impact of the power outages in Texas, unevenly felt by people in the state?
Yeah, various disparities, right? So we saw some racial disparities in, what communities had their power out for longer periods of time. We know that low-income communities, communities of color, already live in less efficient housing. And so without power to adequately warm your home, those homes would get colder quicker. We also saw, there are analyses looking at, who suffered the most from a public health perspective, what communities had people, that needed to be hospitalized. And so we also know that now there are like massive bills because the utilities and the way Texas is regulated, we're able to charge people like market rates on the energy that they use. And so, some people were like, oh, I still have electricity, I'm lucky. And then they got their utility bill, right? And so, so that, we kind of talked in our other questions about kind of the spatial element of, disparities in how our energy system is set up. And so that comes out, dramatically when we have issues like this, any kind of climatic issue, any kind of, hacking or, anything like that adds a shock to the system, we see that play out across geography.
Yeah, and speaking about just how it plays out across geography, one of the parts that you talked about in your recent lecture talked about just the local ways in which energy injustice manifests, right? You talked about you were talking about getting away from, kind of like rational economic choice models, right, around this stuff, and talking about what does it mean to buy a $6 LED bulb, at a corner store, because, you might be living in a city like Detroit that has a lack of big box stores, versus what is that choice like buying a $2 LED bulb in a place like Lowe's, right, or in a suburb where those type of stores are abundant. And you also talked about just the difference, right, in the pricing and how these things are priced in different neighborhoods, because people might be buying them in different ways or in different spaces. Can you talk a little bit about more examples or other examples, to kind of help us better understand how energy policies interact with these other forms of social inequality to create and recreate these challenges in different communities?
Mm-hmm. So another example could be, I think in the lecture I might have talked about communities that that host energy generating sites, right? A lot of times those communities are Black and brown, low income, but the people living in those communities live in smaller homes, consume less energy. But if you look at where high energy consumption occurs, it's in wider, wealthier communities with bigger homes, but they don't have to look at a smokestack, right? So they don't see the the dirtiness or the unwanted elements of our energy system. But then those same communities that do see the smokestacks have $7 light bulbs and don't have stores with Energy Star rated appliances, and may not have public transportation or private transportation to get to those stores. And so how do we work with commercial entities and communities to provide those services? A lot of utilities are doing marketplaces online now. And so how do you educate people about that? Doing appliance replacement programs. And so there is, again, this kind of burden versus benefit imbalance that is perpetuated in our energy system that we don't talk about enough and that our policies don't necessarily address.
Yeah, one part particularly around that point, I think it was a little bit before there, and you just talked about it right now, right? Just the I think one part that I found interesting was the discrepancy between Detroit proper and the suburbs, right, with regards to energy consumption. And you talked a bit about it, but I would love to talk a little bit about more, because I think I would have assumed that, there have been a lot of resources, right? Whether we're talking about capital, human capital, jobs, plants, et cetera, right? That have been pumped into the suburbs at the expense of a city like Detroit, right? Explaining, these increases in more energy. Much of the Detroit housing, right, is still based off of older housing stock, which I would have assumed would have increased the energy consumption, just because there's, a lot of homes built with less energy efficient means in mind. And so look, I was wondering how to grapple that, make sense of that in my mind, right? There might be people using less energy, but using less energy through less effective means. I think I was surprised to see that in the graph.
Yeah, you hit on a really good point, Lester. So there are a couple of metrics, right? So there's the actual consumption. So like how much energy are you consuming and your utility company charges you for. And so what we see when we look at that metric is that people in suburbs consume more energy because they have larger homes, more gadgets. But the other metric is called the energy use intensity, which is how much energy are you using based on the size of your home. And so this is where we see that imbalance and disparity. So people living in smaller homes, so when you divide that by the size of their energy consumption by the size of their home, then you see a larger number for lower income communities, Black and Hispanic communities, because as you said, they're using the energy less efficient because of old appliances, no insulation, older windows. And so I often use the energy use intensity metric because that's when you see the inequities in our energy system, and it also helps in targeting energy efficiency programs, appliance replacement programs, HVAC system upgrades, roof replacements, insulation, and so I've always been trying to show that difference between consumption and efficiency. And if we're really investing in, helping people afford their energy, we need to invest in efficiency.
Yeah. You had talked about, how you conceptualize energy justice as kind of fitting in between these two camps of, environmental justice and then climate justice, both of these movements. Both of these movements have grown considerably. But there are still people who talk about climate change, without respect to race. There are still people who talk about race without respect to the effects of climate change on racialized people. How can we more effectively bring these two conversations together?
That's a really good point. So climate change is one of those issues where, when people describe it, they say, oh, it should be a unifier because it's impacting everybody, right? While that is true, we know that it's not impacting everybody the same, right? We know our brothers and sisters on island nations are being impacted by sea level rise at astronomical rates and may lose their homelands. We know that Black and brown and in low-income communities are living in areas with less tree cover. And so when we talk about warmer summers, the degree difference between a warmer summer in the suburbs and a warmer summer in an inner city with no trees and a bunch of buildings and asphalt is totally different. And so, yes, while we all will be impacted by climate change, there are disparities that we need to address that can then create interventions to mitigate that or adapt to it. So that's a whole nother debate whether we are going to mitigate climate change or adapt to it. And I think energy and housing and buildings play such an important role in that because, as I stated in the lecture, environmental justice movement was risen to address a lot of the decisions that were made about siting of energy plants and waste plants. Climate change is being caused by our energy consumption, and how we generate energy. And so an energy justice perspective says, we know there are racial and spatial disparities in where we've built our energy system. And we know that it is causing climate change. And we know that it's having a disparate impact on people of color, low-income people, other disadvantaged communities. So let's make it real and let's address it, from that perspective.
And I have a softball question. Help us solve climate change. No.
I know, right? All right, let's go. All right, step one.
Well, one thing that you just mentioned, right, in responding to that, was the balance between mitigating climate change, mitigating the effects of climate change versus adapting to it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm all for mitigation, right? I think there are both social and technological solutions to our climate crisis. But I do think in the interim, we need to be honest about what's changing and how we adapt to that. right? Because without adaptation, there's extinction. And so, we have to have all these conversations about, and you see it happening without people really talking about it that way. Boston building taller seawalls, and, people developing in Miami, and, trying to design for additional flooding and sea level rise. Water battles in the, Midwest, between California and Kansas, about the Colorado River. And so, there's all these things that are happening that are kind of adaptation mechanisms, or the manifestation of people trying to adapt. But we aren't doing a good job of framing it that way, so we can have like real effective strategic policies.
Part of that, what you said, I think segues well into this next part. In thinking about your work, and particularly thinking about the lecture that you gave, I'm thinking I want to highlight, the uniqueness of your case, right, of Detroit versus its metropolitan area. And so thinking about, just the distinction between, for example, where people of color are located in the metropolitan area versus energy consumption, or the energy burdens. I wanted to think about just the role of history, particularly in Detroit, and how that informs our understandings of energy justice. What would energy consumption look like over time, or how should our understandings of what that looks like over time inform what energy justice is or should be in places like Detroit and and abroad.
You just put my next paper idea out there, Lester. But I think you hit on a really really interesting kind of storyline, right? Is that so the U.S. Department of Energy, Energy Information Administration, which is the kind of one of the research arms of the Department of Energy, does a survey called the Residential Energy Consumption Survey. So they do it about every 3, 4, 5 years, based on congressional funding. And so we have this study back to the 70s. Remember, I said, we started understanding these disparities back in the 70s. And so that's a rich data set that I, really want to take some time and kind of dig through and see, how does energy consumption, particularly for Black and African American households, change over time? How does that map on with, kind of spatial relocation of folks? Do we have major shifts in employment and where people moved? And now people are thinking about gentrification and displacement, right? And so, are there shifts as, wealthier people, younger, wealthier, whiter people move from the suburbs to downtowns and buy up houses and renovate those houses and make them more efficient, add insulation? Will you see some shifts as, lower income people are pushed out into kind of first ring suburbs? And so I think that is definitely the next frontier of thinking about, how does this kind of spatial transformation in our metropolitan areas, can we look at energy metrics to kind of see what's happening, kind of understand what's happening, kind of plan for what's happening? Because I think those things are very linked to each other. Because when I started doing this work, back in like 2012, you could really track, the energy disparities to racial segregation, right? The persistence of racial segregation, hyper segregated metropolitan areas, which, Detroit goes back and forth between number 1 and number 2. I was living in Kansas City, which is in the top 25, St. Louis, and so you can clearly look at, some of the historical red line districts and see that those are where you still have older housing stock. People are being shut off. People have past due bills. People are using energy inefficiently. And so, we know kind of where these challenges are located. But again, you talked about an individual thing. Most of our policies are individual based, person-based policies versus place-based.
Thank you for that. I especially was thinking about, kind of the ongoing and continued efforts, like you mentioned, right, to attract the young professional types to places like Corktown or places like Midtown, and how this shift, or this renewed investment in bringing folks into the city center from the suburbs informs that. So thanks. One thing you also talked about was about the community responses to the actions of DTE, in the Michigan legislature, including the creation of the Work for Me DTE campaign. All of this, is informed by Detroit's rich heritage of organizing.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious, what are your thoughts, or what do energy justice efforts look like in cities and towns and rural areas, that have a different legacy of organizing and a different kind of local politics orientation?
Yeah. So for everybody's understanding, there are three types of utilities. So there are investor-owned utilities, which are just what it sounds like. For people in Chicago, that's Con Edison. In Detroit, that's DTE. So investors, put up front money into the utility to build infrastructure and provide energy for us, and then each year they get a return on that investment paid for by us, the ratepayers. Then there are some people call them publicly owned utilities, but I call them municipal owned utilities, and these are government owned utilities because it's not necessarily owned by the public. So these are your cities that have their own power and light system or whatever, and then there are rural co-ops which cover the rest of the country, right? So 80% of us are covered by investor-owned utilities, and then the rest are either owned by local governments or co-ops. The activism in these three types of utilities looks very different. Investor-owned utilities are regulated by state public service commissions or public utility commissions. In Illinois, I think it's called the Illinois Commerce Commission. And so these are state bodies that are either elected, appointed, that tell the utilities how much they can charge us, what type of energy they need to develop and create. Municipal utilities, usually city councils or a separate board, might regulate that utility. And then co-ops are in theory owned by the co-op members. So everybody that lives in that area is a part owner in the utility. So the activism there in co-ops, you don't see it as much. There is some growing activism in the South, which seems to be really interesting, just pushing co-ops to actually create cleaner energy. So, get rid of coal plants and things. In municipal utilities, you don't see a lot of activism either. Just because that's part of it's almost like your water bill, right? Oh, it's too high, but that's the price of living in the city. And then investor-owned utilities where you see the real activism. One, because it's baked into the regulation. And so because we have these public bodies, they have timelines when people can engage, they have processes for people to engage. And so people can actually feel like they can participate in that process. And so the Work for Me DTE movement, there's some movements in, like I say, in the Southeast, We the Plug though in Georgia, which was really fascinating to watch because everybody was concerned about the Senate runoff. And they took the opportunity to say, well, also on the ballot, we have Public Service Commission. Oh, what is that? And they educated people in Georgia about who your Public Service Commission is, what they do, and why it's important that you also vote for that, and which candidates you should vote for. And so there's a whole movement called energy democracy, which I think is kind of part of the energy justice framework, but it's really about how do you put people back into the decision-making process of energy. And so I think it's going to be exciting to watch that over the next few years as people start thinking about energy.
Definitely. As we are talking and just kind of rapping about access, justice, democracy, and decision making, I'm reminded, that Detroit and Flint had emergency managers installed, to oversee their municipal finances, decisions that profoundly, affected the people that live there. And that's putting it lightly. Profoundly is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. To my understanding, in 2018, I think that was the first time since 18 years, I think, that Michigan didn't have an emergency manager in place. how does the state's history, Michigan in particular, but other states this might apply to, how does this history of emergency management, affect these kind of governance-y questions, about how governments, about how corporations work or don't work, to be accountable to the public with regards to energy resources?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of an emergency manager is someone that comes in to really right the ship, right the finances of a local government, right? And so in areas that are, served by an investor-owned utility, who's not regulated by the local government, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind at that point, right? Because it's really hard for the emergency manager to even focus on that part, because they're probably focused on water and sewer, streets, lights, and so one instance is a town that kind of sits in the middle of Detroit called Highland Park. So a smaller city within the larger city of Detroit. And during their, financial challenges, they weren't able to pay the utility for streetlights. And so what you saw was that, after getting so far behind on their payment of having streetlights, the utility came and took the lights out. So you have this kind of, I forget the shape of the city. It was kind of like a square, but a rectangle, totally dark. Yeah, when you look at the city, from a satellite. But because of that, there was a movement, a group called Solidarity that rose up and said, okay, we're gonna, use the power of the sun, and we're gonna, operate in solidarity around bringing lights back to Highland Park. And so now that organization is talking about, co-op and, municipalizing a utility within Highland Park. And so, around that kind of challenge of, financial crisis, the community came together to say, like, well, how do we provide this basic service to ourselves that, now our city can no longer provide? And so in those challenges, I think the loss of, democracy, with emergency managers, has shifted some of that back to, community engagement and social capital and collective efficacy. And so there is some positive for the community that can come out of that, even though we have, great examples of non-positive things that happen because of emergency management.
Yeah, I always think the case of Highland Park and Hamtramck, right, for that example, are just mad fascinating. For the viewers, right, there are two cities that are like 2 square miles apiece, just stuck in the middle of Detroit, right, and formed, right, basically just kind of out of a response of the Dodge brothers and Ford not wanting to pay municipal taxes when Detroit was annexing places
for their industrial complexes.
I'll never get a job before it, I guess. Well, I think we do have some viewer questions, so I'm gonna kind of go into the viewer questions. And so Tiangelo, what up, T, has a question, particularly thinking about what we just talked about. The question is, what about the monopolies that these different energy companies have, and how do we work to break them up?
Yeah, that's a really so there's a book called the Energy Company of the Future, and I might be getting the title wrong, but it talks about, again, I mentioned how this model served its purpose, right? And so how do you begin to envision a different structure? Because right now the structure is you can just leave the monopoly if you can afford solar or some other renewable energy, right? But what that ends up doing is leaving the cost on the people that can't or don't know how to leave the system. And I don't think that's fair either, right? And so I think one way is kind of the push for energy democracy, where people are more engaged in the decision-making process to create a utility, public utility, because they are considered public utilities that we all want, right? And so, going to Public Service Commission and saying, no, you're not going to build a new gas plant, or you're not going to build a new coal plant, which hopefully nobody is building new coal plants, but saying we want solar in our communities. We want to own solar in our communities. We want to do geothermal and use the ground to heat our homes. And so it's really about, kind of pushing that energy democracy as we move to some other, ultimate form of energy sovereignty, which is another movement of like, we don't need the utility companies, we can do it on our own. And so I always think too, like, if there was some reparations package, how does energy play a role in that, right? Because energy costs are like the second highest cost that people pay in their housing costs after rent or mortgage. And so is there an opportunity, if we're going to right the wrongs of the past, that, energy justice, energy sovereignty is a part of that?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Bonnie has another great question coming from the crowd. The question asks or states, solar energy is often, mentioned as renewable and sustainable, but the rare minerals used to make the panels are not, renewable or sustainable. How can solar energy become more sustainable?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a colleague of mine at UC Merced in California, she does life cycle analysis, life cycle assessment. So looking at the cradle to grave process of all types of energy technology. And so we actually wrote a paper trying to think about a social life cycle assessment, which is when we begin to think about, where are these rare minerals coming from? I had a student that did a research paper on the Congo, looking at how cobalt, which we use in batteries and EVs and solar, is actually causing war, in that country. And so I think you bring up a really good point about, we need to be more strategic and think about, are there reuse potentials for the materials that we are mining from countries that are far from the US and even sometimes don't even benefit from those rare minerals. There's some research going on now looking at if we really expand electric vehicles, what do you do with batteries after they've reached their, full life? And so I think, thinking about kind of the moving away from a throwaway society to a reuse society is how we make it more sustainable. And we have, with every panel, you have 20 to 30 years to kind of think about that, but we need to do that now.
Thank you for that. We've got two more questions. One of them being, hearing you should remind us all, right, that, energy comes from the sun and the wind and the earth. It makes us wonder if you see a relationship between energy injustice and colonialism. The question says, we're taking things from the earth that should belong to everyone and selling them as a commodity. Is that a connection that you see? And is American culture always going to be opposed to the idea of energy as a human right?
Yeah. I saw a meme that said, it was like, I think it was like, God, the air you're giving us, the air you gave us for free, they're down here charging us for it. And I think that's the same for like energy and water, right? And so again, we have commoditized these things, and it's primarily because of the infrastructure that we built to deliver it to people. And we have to maintain that infrastructure because we all do want, to be able to turn our lights on and do these Zoom calls and, get our clean drinking water. But now, because we do have technology that allows us to convert that and make that, renewable, again, like how do we reframe the system? And should there be a time where you no longer pay for it because you are producing it on your own? And I don't know if that's the case, and I don't know how long it'll take us to get there. But again, I think about if there's massive investment from the federal government that leverages both public and private dollars to expand renewable energy, people need to be at the center of that, whether it's through jobs, whether it's through access to this technology. And it shouldn't just be for, the wealthy who can, finance it. It should be for everybody.
Thank you for that. And the last question, if we can get personal for a moment, kind of delves into the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Reames, I'm talking to. And so the question asked, and states that it's always really interesting, and I agree, right, to learn about people's personal journeys, particularly how Black scholars come into their own identity.
Mhm.
One of our viewers shared in the chat an issue of living in an old building and literally being scared, to turn on the heat because the electric bill was too high. If we can, for a moment, ask a personal question and don't feel obligated. Is energy justice something that's affected you personally, or just broadly speaking, how did you get into this, type of research?
Yeah. That's a great question. I've been thinking about, the connection between just broadly energy and race, right? And particularly in the Black community. And so, we all know, grandma, mama saying, stay in or out, don't let all my air out, and so
Yeah.
there is this and I was thinking about my dad and how he would go around at night and unplug things. And then later on in life, I learned about energy vampires, which is like things plugged in that are just sucking up energy, but not really being used. And I was like, oh, my dad was like killing energy vampires back as a kid, right? But we didn't talk about it that way. And so I think there's this inherent connection that, we as people and, this could be in other cultures have with energy that, again, we may not know all the technological terms, but it's there. Fast forward to when I started studying this, it was partly just timing. So when I applied for my PhD, I wanted to study this green infrastructure because I was interested in stormwater and things like that. But it was during the last recession. And so there was a ton of money coming from the federal government in the stimulus, and a lot of it was focused on energy. Former President Obama felt like energy was a way to kind of this three-pronged approach to create jobs, help people economically and help the environment, right? So kind of the triple bottom line of sustainability. And so I think, because my advisor was like, hey, won't you, study what's happening with all this money that's focused on energy? And I'm like, if you're paying me to do that, I'll do it. But when I started doing the research, like I said, I just learned how important energy was to people's lives and how much it impacted people either positively or negatively, and how the policies were missing the mark to help people. And like I said, the woman I talked to about her anxiety when she saw a utility truck, another woman that had her furnace replaced and how, she talked about it changing her life because she participated in a government program to replace her furnace. And so I started to see these different, connections that went beyond just the, kind of economics of energy, but, kind of the real like place-based connection that energy has. And the more I do this work, working with, activists in Detroit or in Missouri, or in the South. The research shows this is life or death. The research shows that we have the technology and that we're not, distributing it equitably. And we're in a moment, we have a moment, right? With social consciousness around Black Lives Matters and climate change. And, so how do we take advantage of this moment to, push this forward?
Wow. I think that's a great question to kind of bring us to a close. I do just want to say I am very appreciative, and I want to thank you a lot, Dr. Reames, for being in conversation with me today. I learned a lot from your work. I hope to continue to learn a lot from your work. I hope you put me in the liner notes for that paper that I hope is coming.
Yeah, right. You're in there now.
And that
you might have to help write it too.
Oh, ooh. Well, all right.
See,
I got you. No, I got you. I got you. I won't be an energy vampire with academic work.
Really great talking to you, Lester.
Don't be an academic vampire because there's a lot of those out there.
You said it.
Man, listen, we'll talk about that. That's at the after party discussion. I want to say thank you so much to both of you. I think that, where you just ended, even talking about the Black Lives Matter movement for Black lives, I think that the more we do have these types of conversations, we realize that if we are going to talk about freedom, if we're going to talk about abolition, if we're going to talk about reparations, if we're going to talk about a vision of what it means to be liberated as Black people and as all people, there are so many facets to understand. And I feel so educated by your work, Dr. Reames, to understand the ways in which this thing that, you know, I think has really been hidden is really an important part of our freedom. And hearing you talk, it kind of reminds me of the issue of food deserts and the way that for a long time, you know, when I grew up and, you can only go to the corner store to get certain type of things, or it might be hard to go to the grocery store. We thought that was just a us problem. Right. Mm-hmm. And then you learn that actually this is a pattern and actually there's a word for it. And I really hope that more and more people will pick up these threads of your work and to understand these are not just things, you know, that we are dealing with individually. These are system-wide things, and the system could be different. So thank you so much for that insight.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ewing.
Yeah, especially as a person who compulsively unplugs all of my appliances all of the time. I'm just unplugging them. Thank you both so much. I want to remind everybody watching that tomorrow, Friday, it is Friday, which means we have a brand new lecture coming. It's going to be Ashawn Crawley talking about Black sacred life. You do not want to miss it. Check it out right here on our YouTube channel. And next Thursday, 1 week from today, Thursday, June 3rd at 6 p.m., always Central Time, you can join us in a Q&A with Dr. Crawley, which is going to be really amazing. And you don't have to remember any of these details if you sign up for our newsletter at blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter. I want to say thank you one more time to our team, Imani Legron and Sianda Mohutsua, as well as our amazing ASL interpreter, Barbara Williams-Finley, all of our friends and colleagues at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture and the Mellon Foundation. And mostly, I want to thank Lester Kern III for being such an amazing discussant, and Dr. Tony Reames for joining us. If you want to learn more about his work, you can check him out at thegreenscholar.com. I know all the other Green Scholars are very salty that they did not think about registering that domain before him. Too bad. You just should have stayed woke and thought about that. And so that's it for this week's edition of the Black Freedom Lectures. I'm Eve Ewing. Thank you so much. And everybody,